that. Yeah, totally. This is the Free Jerry's Brain Call for Monday, December 20th, 2021. Getting close to the end of 2021. It's kind of crazy. Yeah, I like backgrounds. At one point, I spent some time just, and now and then I'll find an image and I'll be like, oh, I'll save that as a Zoom background. And Julian, is that a school or where's that behind you?
That is the town plaza in Santa Fe.
Oh.
This is the building where all the artisans line up and sell jewelry. So, well, not line up, they sit down and spend the day there.
Yeah, that's funny. I remember in Oaxaca, there's a street off the main square, kind of south of the main square, where there's chocolate shops. And you go into one of these stores and you walk up at the counter and you order your mix, your preference for the mix of chocolate. And it's a mix of cinnamon, sugar, and cocoa, and raw cocoa, and maybe something else, I don't know. But you say like 80%, 20%, whatever you want to say. They then put that into a plastic bag. You grab your bag and you walk over to a guy in a white coat standing in front of a green machine, who then takes your bag, pours it into the intake up at the top of the machine. The machine goes wugga 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 wugga. He puts your plastic bag under the spout on the way out, and it basically processes your chocolate, your blend, to make it like nice sort of semi-smooth. It's totally not fondant process. It's like nice and rough and all that. But you walk away with your own custom blend of chocolate. It's really cool. And there's a bunch of these sort of lined up on a street like that looks a lot like what you have behind you. It was a fun experience. I like the origins of chocolate. And chocolate is also a fermented food, which nobody knows.
Indeed.
Because the seeds have to be fermented. Basically, you pull the shell off the seeds and then you ferment the pods somehow. I don't know how or what, but without that, it doesn't get there either.
I'm constantly amazed at how throughout history humans have been willing to think, I don't know what that plant is, but maybe if I do this to that and then do that to that, it'll be edible.
And then there we go. Like cassavas are not edible. They're poisonous unless you process them.
But I'm also struck by the number of dead mushroom experts.
Yeah. Wait, does that disqualify them as experts? I mean, if you had one too many and
well, that question reminds me of the guy who jumped off the Eiffel Tower to test his parachute.
Yeah.
At that point, he was the expert on parachutes.
Yeah.
3 seconds later.
Exactly. Hi, Lauren.
Hey there.
Thanks for joining.
Yeah. Sorry to be late.
No worries.
Hello, Laura.
Yeah. We're still in the informal chat.
Yeah. We're still debriefing and sharing weird backgrounds. And Pete's on break through next week, I think. So he won't be in any of our calls this week.
Fair enough. So, Mark, thanks a lot for the invite Saturday. It was great fun.
You're very welcome. I had hoped for more organization and more speakers, but it was what it was.
Well, the invite did go a bit late, sorry to say.
I'm sorry?
The invite did go a bit late, sorry to say.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's several different communities that I was trying to grab and juggle everything, and I'll do it better next time, or even better, have somebody else do it.
And I want to apologize because it was my intention to attend, except I had to meet somebody at 2, which was the starting hour. So I went and had a physical meeting, and then I got back and was completely distracted and didn't end up joining the Zoom because that was my goal. But I'd love to hear a bit about like interesting notes, what happened, etc.
Yeah, so basically 2 to 2:30 social, that was great. Everybody who had volunteered to help was showed up after 2:30, so that was perfectly fine. Let's see. Typically there's like 7 or 8 presenters, and this time it was Jamie Joyce, me, and Tiago Forte of
second brain, build a second brain.
Building a second brain, build a
Yep.
second brain, something like that.
Yep.
And a little bit from Sean, whose last name I forget, and a little bit from
Sean sounds like, which Sean? Give us an association for Sean. And is it SEAN or SHAUN?
No,
or-
SH.
SHAUN and Murphy, I believe. SHAUN.
Yeah, Murphy, Sean Murphy.
I do not know
He's
him.
doing this this neuron thing, absolutely fascinating
Oh,
work
really?
on neuron.com, NOORON.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
visualizing semantic web stuff. Very
Oh,
good.
it's spelled not UN but WN, and I misspelled it. And here, let me just switch back and share screen. So here's Neuron, and here's Sean Murphy.
That one, yes.
Oh.
I thought it was a U, but maybe it's a W.
So this is his Wikipedia page. I'm going to click on it, and it'll tell us right now. He likes motorcycles. I met him at Pattern Workshop in Ben Lomond many years ago. I don't remember. So it is W, and that's him. I think his face seems very familiar. So yeah. And he lives in Berlin, right? Or does he still? Yes, he does.
I believe he
Yeah.
does. Yes.
And he's
Cool.
Canadian, amusingly.
Well, that's makes him better than most humans. That bumps him above average right there.
Except
And
to
so
eat.
he and Eric Rangel wanted to speak at the last minute. So they had about 8 minutes each and 2 minutes for questions, and then
Yeah.
we wrapped it up, and people took off, and then we went out to dinner, and boom.
What was the event, Mark?
Informal mimicsy. There's a group on Facebook, Ideograph, Mimics, and Intelligence Augmentation, about 230 members.
Oh,
And the founder of that group didn't connect with me and allow me to invite people, so I could only invite the people who I knew. So it was fine. That's about the size of every other Mimics meetup that we've had. About 17 people in person, about 8-9 people online. And this is the first online one, and basically just try to figure out the next one. A few people asked for more sooner rather than every 6 months or year or two, which I started it. Well, I mean, as far as I know, I started it about 18 years ago here in San Francisco, having people over at my house, including Bob Horn and Jack Park. And yeah, I talked with Bob, and Bob was made the suggestion to be interviewed, and then John Kelly, I talked to him, and he said he could do that. So in the future, better things. But and Jerry and I had kind of talked about maybe doing some kind of conference online, and I just don't have the time or energy at the moment, but hey, it worked out. There's a recording which I'll process, and I'll follow up on still trying to get that recording, which is in the works, but Caitlin, who does the editing of the recording, is also kind of buried as
so what was your most interesting takeaway? You too, Marc Antoine. Like if you know what I was always taught that no matter how long the lecture or the gathering, there are 3 takeaways. There's really no more. So what if you're repressed, what are your takeaways?
Good question.
It is a great question. I don't like hosting these things because I can't write things down and pay attention to what people are saying. I am the host. I am, watching the building and, making sure everybody gets fed. My takeaway is, boy, this is not about me. I'm glad people were very happy and got benefit, but, doing this without help is not particularly fun. That was my takeaway.
For me, it was I mean, it confirms a lot of things I know. I mean, I know Jamie's work really well. I work with her, so it was good to hear the pitch again, but that part was, okay, I know that pitch quite well by now. But what's interesting is we're all trying to create these curated views. I mean, Jamie's working on curated views. Most of us are working on, and actually Mark is a bit of an exception because he's working on the kind of very, let's put everything in and have on the fly, on demand views, like, but in a way it's an artifact, which is a form of curation also. As you said, time, you trade space for time, so it's a form of curation. And that's a reality. We cannot have global views because there's too much. But it reinforces the feeling that we must find a way to embed curated views in global views, or at least make them talk to one another. Like on the one hand, I don't believe in the global view. And on the other hand, I see all these curated views as they have to be A, talking to one another, and B, in a way that you can see what's outside the edge of the curation. Like the curation is extremely important. I believe in curated views strongly, 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 and the diversity of them, because there's never going to be one view to rule them all. But all the more reason for them to be ways to escape the frame and have all this other space around the frame. That's just reinforcing something I've always known, and seeing the importance of curated views, and seeing the importance of, and the other thing that I saw that was very interesting is how the whole question of structured versus unstructured, like Mark made it very clear, his views connects ideas without structuring them too much. Jerry does the same. Jerry structures more than anybody else in this conversation, I think. And the whole, again, both are necessary. Structure is an impediment, is friction. Like adding structure is friction, and it means you won't put stuff in the tool if you have to, if structure is a condition for putting stuff in the tool. On the other hand, lack of structure has its own disadvantages, and I'm big for unstructure. But again, so can we put structure progressively and so on and so forth? I keep going back to that. Can we add structure after we've done the rough unstructured draft? And that's my other little bit. So again, this is reinforcing things, but what's reinforcing also is that there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of great people working on this, there's a lot of stuff that has been done, and oh my God, we need to connect more. Yeah, that's my takeaway.
Go ahead, Julian.
I was going to mention a couple of things, and first is that a curated view is still a real-time concept, because if you're talking about a living knowledge base, the result of the curation actually changes from moment to moment. And the second is that even that a curated view can result in complexity. And so you need to have a hierarchy of curation within a curation.
Curation is personal. That's not something that I believe, I mean, some people would disagree, but I mean, a good curator can make a curated view intelligible to others, but that's yet another skill, right? Not all, like a lot of curated views are personal, and some curated view are intelligible for a lot of people. And
it certainly happened within VR experiences that obviously somebody or some team has designed the experience, but then there's still a lot of room for the person, because the VR experience is subjective. There's still a lot of room for the person to go through it as they please, but still within the bounds of that design. So.
I'm speaking about the basic fact that different people have different ways of understanding things, and you need more than one explanation.
Yeah, this is all subjective. So.
Yeah, the kind of what Mike Caulfield calls choral descriptions.
What's choral descriptions?
CHORIL. I'm sure you have that in your brain. Yeah. By the way, Mike Caulfield wrote a fascinating article recently that I'd like to discuss, but
Please.
sorry, I don't want to interrupt. Go ahead, Laura.
Okay.
No, I was just going to say there's a difference between curation, whether by the mode of capture, my daily journal, or notes from a conference, versus intentional. Here's my accumulated notes about, my dream border collie someday, versus versus information retrieval. So that the way things are stored on a hard drive or it's stored on a CD-ROM, it's flabbergasting to me that it's all over the place, and somehow that's better or that works. That a library isn't that way, but some electronic storage or digital storage is. And so I was just going to say that in terms of making things, the breadcrumb trail, more usable to more people coming along after, that is both a logic thing and a UX thing, and that the mode or the intention of why the information was gathered and curated by the originator is different than what happens of where the bytes are. And to me, those are interesting dissonances.
And if I can just jump in for a second. Well, never mind. Go ahead, Mark Anton.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I was going to comment on what you just typed in the chat. Your definition of curation explicitly excludes views composed from information retrieval, because I was going to ask, are curated views merely the other side of default views when you do a database query, for example? So show me all the Congress critters in the US Congress results in a predictable and probably organized alphabetically or maybe sorted in some other way, but that is not a curated view. That is a default view of a query. A curated view would be like, oh, I'm going to separate them into the sedition caucus and people trying to defend America for democracy. And that's curation. And I'm adding a layer, an intermediate layer of nodes that would layer on top very nicely of hey, here's all the Congress critters, et cetera, et cetera. So is it that simple, or is there more to curated views, a lot more to curated views than I'm thinking?
Well, it's interesting because something Laura said makes me realize that I'm using it a bit too loosely, because there's a difference between curated for self-consumption, which is, this is my collection that I'm building over time, versus, and that may include query results in a way, though, because you decide to put that query results in your personal collection. Or for me, when I say curated, I mostly mean curated for an audience. Yes, exactly. I'm taking, there's all this stuff I have from a query or from the web or from my personal connection, it doesn't matter. And here I'm going to present a curated view that I think is something that can be absorbed by an audience at a point in time as a self-contained unit. The boundary is very important. And so there's the intent, there's the personal, and person can be a group, right? But there's an editorial process where you make choices, and it's a subset of a big bunch of set. Now I'm saying many things, and for me they come together. But you're right. Maybe I need to unbundle these aspects of what I mean by curated view, and that is a perfectly valid point.
So I'm just showing a little bit in my brain, because this notion of curated views is absolutely crucial to my use of the brain,
Yep.
like central to my use of the brain. And I feel like my brain is this, one of the reasons I love it is it's this elegant mix of stuff that anybody would have categorized the same way and would have put under the same thing, like actors in movies, assuming that the in was represented the same way, but actors are acted in movies. And if you look at IMDb, it'll give you a result, but then editorial layered right next to it in the same space. And that's unusual for a lot of tools, because a lot of tools are only database lookup tools and don't let you then insert opinion or narrative or whatever else. And so so this topic, I didn't realize how important this topic is to me, but it is. And I'm trying to figure out, why is it not more broadly discussed, or what's happening, or how does it go, or where do we go? What links should I go look at? Who's written well about this? Those kinds of questions.
Well, because most folks stop at keyword search and the first page of Google. Right? So it's like we none of us are on this group are satisfied with that.
Yeah.
In any way. It's deeply frustrating.
Hey, Jerry, can I share screen for just a second?
You bet.
Oh, is it already set up that way?
I've got it set up so that anybody
Okay,
can see
okay.
screen better.
I came across a quote yesterday on the Freakonomics Radio podcast that for me sort of explains the brain and explains the climate web. And so I thought I'd share it because it's relevant to this conversation as a shortcut. And the whole idea is the shortcut isn't an answer. It's a stepping stone to help people get to frontiers of knowledge so they can make their own journeys into the darkness. And it's from a mathematician, Marcus de Sautoy, who just came out with this new book on thinking better, the art of the shortcut in math and life. But for me, that just encapsulated what I'm trying to do with the climate web and climate change knowledge. And in a sense, I think it encapsulates what anybody's trying to do with the brain that they're trying to have other people use, including Jerry's brain, is this idea of can we turn it into a shortcut for people to jump beyond where they currently are, as opposed to necessarily thinking of it as a repository of all knowledge. So I just loved this quote yesterday, so I thought I'd share it.
Do you mind copy pasting it into our chat?
Yeah, okay.
If you can, that'd be great. And I've got de Sautoy in my brain, but not this book, so I'm adding it. And it's, yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Julian's had his hand up.
Yeah, I was going to go to Julian.
I wanted to bring up, the classical notion of curating is somewhat akin to, well, classically it meant that somebody was going to pick out what pieces of art are going to hang on the walls. And if you think about it, this is a database query, right? And if you think about the way people treat databases and knowledge bases, if they issue a query and they get back a bunch of results. And as you've probably gotten from my comments over the last year, is that I consider it a much more interactive experience. So that for me, the query and the result being an interactive process means that it's always moving. And at some point we'll have to move from curating being a query response result to being more active. And you might even actually have to curate the queries as opposed to curate what the query is going to produce.
For me, as I said, query is almost the antithesis of curation, though you can curate from a query result. I like the idea of curating the queries. I think that's absolutely a great extension, saying, I'm creating a collection by curating queries and taking like the union or intersection or whatever, and saying that makes a lot of sense. But do you agree with my distinction between query and curation, or do you disagree? I'm not sure I got that well.
Julian, that's for you, I think.
Yeah. That one I want to think about. It's because of what I just said, is I view the whole process as being interactive rather than a loop.
So if I can contribute to that, though, for me, I'm not sure that's a clear distinction for me, because I think a really excellent query is curation. And then also, you might be staring at a situation that is just highly dynamic, and where the query is sorting what falls in and what falls out of what's being seen. Whether it's a standing weather emergency or a coup that's being conducted across the country or whatever else. And if a crowd of people are collaborating to the making of that shared memory, then it might be very dynamic, even as people sort of edit and add things.
So
the dynamic is.
Bring up an example.
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to bring up an example from the Lego L3D database. So I had this L3D had 5 dimensions of query into the database. And one of the dimensions, to explain, this was a database of 3D models of all the bricks and the sets that Lego makes. And one of the index was part of the requirements was that kids can play with each other interactively over the web, which the brand new internet back in the mid-90s. Now, think about computers back then. If you remember the Pentium 2, We're all old enough to remember that thing. And as a home computer, which was the target audience for digital Lego, it just didn't have much power. It could not do a lot of 3D graphics. We had SGIs. The typical home user had a Pentium 1 or 2. So one of the issues in building with Lego, with virtual Lego, was the complexity of the scene. So one of the dimensions of indexing into L3D was, suppose you're building a house, and as you play with the building the front wall, each brick has to be an individual piece. And remember, when I say piece, this was actually a query into the database, which returned 3D graphics. So as you played with each piece had to exist individually, which meant higher computational complexity. But the back wall of the house could be one polygon with a texture map. So that's pretty cheap in terms of CPU requirements. And I say CPU because there weren't any GPUs back then. But as you're playing with this house and you decide to work on the back wall, then you rotate the house, and then suddenly the back wall now needs to be the individual bricks, whereas the front wall has become one polygon with a texture map. So this whole idea, you can see where the notion of dynamic or interaction with the database results in this loss of distinction between query result. Query result, it has to be a living interactive thing.
Go ahead, Mark. I'll come after.
You are muted. There you go. Good.
There I go. So if I remember correctly, Howard Rheingold had this notion of filters in his tools for thought, and basically
He's got the crap filters and stuff like that.
Yeah, but also, it's just another term besides curation and query, and certainly the way that I approach the tool that I hope to share would be something that is heavily experiential, dynamic, and more input focused than sort of output focused. Or at least that's my use of it, where I'm basically using it as a listening tool to enhance, immediate experience. But I realize that, there are tons of people that cannot take notes and listen at the same time. That's certainly a filter right there. But there are people who can, or maybe I just trained myself in that way over the years. So filter, curation, query, inquiry, defining the problem. There's a whole host of, I guess, instrumentalities that differ from person to person. Certainly something like the Build a Second Brain or the Lumen's Zettelkasten have a very specific purpose. Build a second brain, enhance your productivity with, using digital tools in the right way, because this is what we've tested, and you can follow us, you can learn from our experience in how to do X. And Lumen, it's, I want to follow an inquiry into these specific ideas, and then I want to write the paper and get it out there and move to the next paper and basically churn in a very effective, efficient, and hopefully fun way. But there are many different purposes, and I'm kind of, my typical reaction is build a pattern language. And so I would hope that we can get on that someday.
And we started down that path, and Marc-Antoine built a semantic media wiki for pattern language development, and then we tried it out and we realized that renaming things is really important, and that's about curation and that's about collective work. And then we stalled and didn't go try to find a different tool. But I know that there's energy to build pattern languages in different corners of OGM that would be lovely to release into the wild. Lauren, did you want to jump in?
Well, I feel like all of these efforts over time are snapshots of what the human brain in aggregate can do. And so therefore, much like the pharmacopoeia of street drugs, right? They push hard on one set of neurochemicals, but no street drug has been able to combine all those things in the way our brain does. And none of these simulations of aspects of functionality of how a human brain actually thinks, however you define thinking, add up to it. What I would like to see, what I keep aspiring toward, is some sort of setup where, sometimes I think it's about having all the information, quote unquote. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that Wikipedia had all the information. Then the art form is in the suggestion or the direction of queries, right? It's more than query, it's the prompting and the journey through said ubiquitous capture. That's really different than throwing you into a street scene in Tehran and saying, what do you see? You can't see it all. Your brain does this amazing jujitsu and comes up with how to get across the street, right? So it feels, what I would like to see is effort. So just as described today, the different form of mapping or connectivity, or the prompting situations of the two different marks thinking, or the three different marks thinking, and put them together, not at once, but in some sort of relay. It'd be really fun to MVP that, to go, oh, okay. And again, to what use is it, and what are we missing? But it still feels like just barely static grabs of this.
Love that.
I'm not worried about humans being pushed out by robots anytime, or AI anytime soon.
Well, that's a relief. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, could not agree more. I was going to propose, and you made it almost redundant. You know, when Jerry pointed out curation used to be about pictures. A good curator is telling a story with the way that the pictures are organized, and the disposition and the ordering is more than the sum of the parts. And that's what, for me, curation, that's the archetype of curation. And again, maybe we need to untangle the aspects of that. But there is, and this is how it's not a query. Now, what happens when it's a query and it's live and it's active and it's collective, because I also think that's important. Collective curation is a thing. But still, for me, curation is somebody's telling a story with the components that is not immediately apparent in the simple bag of components, by putting them in a certain way, in a certain disposition. And for me, that's what a curated view is. And if it's a live thing, that means that every time something new comes out of the live thing, you need to rethink how it alters the story and how you may have to alter the disposition. Maybe it doesn't. And I agree that you can have a curation of queries where you're putting this query with that query and that query, or that query, bags of query results in relation. And that can also be a story. But you have to be ready for the fact that suddenly the query will turn up things that you that don't make sense with the story anymore, and you'll have to rethink how you're telling the story. And then it's not a curated view anymore. It's a live query view. And I very much, like in my early architectural diagrams for Idealum, and we never got there, but the notion of query view versus curated view was prime distinction. I used to call curated views constellations at the time, because it's again, the points are creating an image, and for me, we're storytelling animals. We're telling stories with those sets of items, knowledge items, and query results are the raw material of the story, but they're not the story. Of course, we're animals. An invasive species, which is another story, but yes.
This topic is so central, because to me, one of the central dynamics here is the titanic battle between the stories in our heads that run human society for centuries at a time often, right? And we're at a moment right now where those stories are being battled over, fought over very, very hard, and we don't exactly know what the next story is going to be. And we're pretty aware, many people are pretty aware that the current narratives are very dysfunctional. They fail on logic, they you know, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of bad stories out there. But the better story, which we may have had, my hypothesis is that, you know, if you look long ago in indigenous cultures, many of them found their way to a really, really good set of stories, which we then managed to squish out of history almost entirely, and luckily not completely. So there's some people are looking for the best new story in some of the best old stories, which is, I think, a really interesting endeavor. But then you have to peel away from it all the crust and cruft that came on top of some of those old stories later, which usually screws up the stories, et cetera. Sorry for the long digression, but for me, a lot of our quest here is finding better tools for expressing those stories and the data that they're based on and the facts around them and everything else. And so I'm torn between catalog requirements and the need to show stuff that exists that is just a list or a database query, and storytelling and narrative string around that. And having those two be very similar to each other is both a little misleading because, gosh, facts look a lot like stories, and how do you tell them apart? But also really convenient, because one of the things, again, that I love about using the brain is that I mix both up all the time. And I think I'm very conscious of that, because when I'm adding opinion that might be controversial, I color it purple, right? The default color of thoughts in the brain is white. I use yellow and purple as my only two other colors, usually. A couple wee exceptions, but yellow means, hey, there's a lot of stuff here, just come look. You know, the yellow is a non-controversial clustering of stuff that might be interesting to you. Go here. And purple is, hey, this is an opinion. It may not have a lot of info, but this is definitely my editorial in the brain. And I'm trying, I don't know when I picked up that habit. It's probably only 3, 4, 5 years old. So there's a bunch of opinions, older ones that are not tagged up purple. But when I hit those, I color them purple now, because I'm like, okay, that calls out that this is narrative in the middle of everything else. And I'm trying always to make my brain useful to outsiders, to people who aren't me, which is its own separate conversation that's longer. But to me, this question about how do we represent facts and stories next to each other or near each other is crucial. It's like civilizational crucial. Homo neurons, yeah. Please, Mark C, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a hobby horse. I have a idea fixe, where when I see one narrative being, you know, posted against another, and, you know, a narrative war going on, I kind of try to look for the higher level container of what narrative is. Now, there is, in the history of consciousness, two ways of looking at it, from antiquity to modern, but also from child to adult. And the sense of, you know, there is at a time a mythic consciousness that is amenable to myth. And how is myth different from story? I think there is a great range of what we call narrative that elides some very specific differences that I really think that, you know, when we use narrative and story, it's just too simple. I think we'll find that it's more complicated than that.
That story's more complicated? Sorry, which piece?
I think so. I think that, you know, there's, you know, you can get a PhD in the structure of narrative and narratology and all kinds of sophisticated ways of breaking down what we are saying as story and narrative into many different kinds of elements, many different kinds of purposes and interactions with the neurology of the human being. And when I hear this kind of conversation. I just think, I believe you'll find it's more complicated than that.
So I
With
don't think
regards to experiencing a story, I was going to remind you all that you're in a maze of twisty passages all alike.
nice. I don't think there's anybody in this conversation who thinks storytelling, any aspect of story is simple. I think we're all really, really aware of how complicated the whole thing is. And to me, a myth is simply a subset of story or narrative, and I'm done. Like, that's very simple to me, very clear cut. A myth is a kind of story.
I think it's the reverse. A story is a kind of myth.
I don't buy that for an instant.
Okay.
Yeah,
You're going to fit in Campbell's hero's journey somewhere in there.
sure. We should touch that just to have done it.
But I don't think Mark is saying that stories are simple, but I think stories are simplified model of a complex reality. And there I'm totally with him.
I think it's all, I think of how we think as a form of hieroglyph, right? That somehow, again, these magical neurochemical mixer brains create this jumble that we find different ways of ordering depending on our circumstances and our agendas, right? If we were all playing an improv game and look at took terms from our backgrounds today, we would come up with 6 different stories on the fly because we had to. And what if we were then given a direction of like, use those words, but your direction is to get people to leave the room or whatever. Like, we can endlessly recombine quote unquote facts or prompts. So I agree with Mark in that there's absolute distinction between what draws us, like what makes us tell stories in the first place. How did, they say, or at least the most common theory that I've heard is, we use our brains to make sense of what we see or experience. And then at some later point, we have some impetus to express that to others or to leave artifacts behind to connote some resonance of how we felt or thought. Again, what's an expression versus what's true narrative? Like, those are distinctions without a difference to me. They are just, what mood am I in? I walk down the street in a myriad of moods. So still the same street, still the same trees, totally different experience.
Or you've used the term prompt and the prompting, and that's a fascinating notion. Could you expand on that?
Well, if I'm in school and we're given a timed essay thing, there's you have whatever the prompt is changes the tone or the things you prioritize in the story you're telling about whatever it is you're experiencing. Right? What was the most exciting thing about your summer vacation? Okay, excitement is the prompt. The constraints are that time frame. What was the thing you learned? Totally different prompts, same constraints. Or again, if it's a game, I might pull out of the hat. I've got to make somebody, stand up and dance in the room. Well, how do I do that? Only using these words. Right.
Or telling a joke, because you can tell the same joke, same way, same words, same expressions, and different audiences will pick up differently.
Correct.
Yeah. And Laura, I love what you must be a fun improv party guide. And Mark, maybe a piece of our difference in terminology is that I'm not thinking of the story. So I'm not thinking that story is like the background radiation of all existence and that there is an or story. I'm thinking that stories are these like little evanescent things that we pick up and little flights of fancy. Stories are very much like in a bubble chamber when you see that the neutrino just like whipped on by and then spun over here and whacked into something else. That's a story. And they're not like there's not one big story that to rule them all. And myths are just a kind of story because myths are maybe even more durable paths through, because we retell the myths and they're like durable stories. That's interesting too. But to me, the background radiation isn't like the mythosphere, or that doesn't make sense to me. Myths are very specific kind of tool for me. You look into Greek mythology or Dagara mythology or Inca mythology, and they're, that's its own set of narrative threads that all bound together to pass down culture. And then I wanted to add that people like John Hagel draw a distinction between story and narrative, which I don't find particularly useful.
John, could you?
John Hagel.
Yeah, could you put that in the chat? And if I could just respond for a second, and then Julian and Mark. This is an emerging kind of research and inquiry of mine, given this kind of itch that I encounter when I hear, there are bad stories, we need a better story. I mean, that's kind of like the simple trope that I hear. And I kind of have responded in the past, a stoplight is not a story. And there are systems, and there are different kinds of consciousness that we humans evoke past certain kinds of reactions to stories, where we find, problem solving as a way of working with our minds in different ways than narrative. Now, this is kind of the beginning of it, but I believe, fully, and agree with you that stories are incredibly important, but I think they're in a layered kind of stack, and we have to look at the whole stack. I'll pass to Julian.
I want to back up a minute to what Jerry was talking about with stories, and this is why I brought up adventure, is because everybody gets through the game differently, but eventually you get to the end, which is the point of the story. And it's an interactive subjective experience, just as I was talking about a little while ago in terms of interacting with a knowledge base. It's not just query result, it's dynamic. So, and I'm going to entirely avoid the issue of story versus narrative. So.
Oh, darn.
I'm very much of the opinion, like, I'm sure there's many things that can be called stories, but for me, there's something that is quite fundamental to storytelling, which is about trying to understand why, and that is trying to find causal links. And I think a lot of myths are trying to imagine causal links for how things are the way they are out of thin cloth. And, the so-called just so stories. And a lot of stories are about, this happened and this happened, and illustrating a causal thread in terms of human motivations. But I think for me, stories are simplified causal models of a complex reality that we pass around. Like these are the kinds of causal mechanism you can use to understand this kind of phenomenon. And we pass it around because we're saying, well, this is what happened. I have this strong belief that things that happen usually happen because there's a constructive interference of many causal mechanisms that converge on a single effect. And many things and so for me, a lot of identified causal mechanisms are valid, but partial. And for me, storytelling is one particular illustration of a causal thread. And that's that way. I think that's one part of what Mark is saying. And that's why we can have different stories, that is different explanations for the same set of events. Okay, I see Jerry really react.
I know. I'm like, So I agree with everything you said, with the following exception. So Mary was impregnated through the voice of God through her ear, which is symbolized by a pigeon. She then gave birth to a guy who died and was resurrected 3 days later. Is that not a story?
It is.
Okay, but it has no scientific causal nothing. It is
I
in
never
fact-
said scientific causal. I said causal.
so there's a causal narrative in here in the Jesus story that you see cause and effect. As I see, not cause and effect, I see incident which just has outcome of some sort. Like
But that's still cause and effect. But it's saying, you know, this happened because that. It's finding reasons, usually grounded in motivations of some real or imagined entity. It's saying this happened because that. And yeah, that's the kind of
but so many
causality.
things in the Christian storytelling are this happened. And it's not like because that, it's just like Jonah got eaten by a whale. How that?
Because it was the will of God.
Well,
it's the will of God bears enormous weight in the biblical narratives,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Well, and in myth and religion, as they can, you know, merge into each other, it's either magic or faith.
Right.
It's either omnipotence, God, and the belief in said God, or it's magic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or
Deus ex machina, short story shortcut.
So somebody fell sick. Oh, a witch cast a spell.
I heard
You
a
know,
great
that's trying to
explanation.
find an explanation because you don't have a germ theory. And so you're looking for a reason, for a cause. And so you invent one.
Right. Go ahead.
Salem
Martin.
witch trials.
I heard a great
If you dig into
explanation.
the Salem witch trials, you'll find a whole different set of causes and effects. So
Mr. Carranza has been trying to slip into the conversation. Please go ahead.
The sense that I got from the difference between mythic consciousness and the other types of consciousness based on and you know, we all have many different types of consciousness within us, but you know, for a Catholic like me, or you know, whatever relationship I still have with the Catholic Church, the wine is the blood and the bread is the body. It's the actual body, the actual blood, as opposed to the wine is the symbol of the blood, the bread is the symbol of the body. And in mythic consciousness, the symbols are concrete. Lightning is God. Rain is everything that rain is. Mom, nourishment.
Tears of liberals
Tears of liberals, exactly.
falling from the sky. That makes sense to me.
But there's a different way that the human consciousness works. And I'm trying to somehow say we need to understand this cognitive, neurophysiological, plus linguistic, plus narrative, plus mythic narrative, as opposed to, you know, things like parking tickets, shopping lists, discourse of different kinds, which are which have a much different purpose than telling a story. It is in some way to offer an explanation. And yes, all models are incomplete, all explanations are incomplete, but it's different from what I see as Star Wars or Stephen King, or the kinds of narratives that we're talking about when we're talking about climate change, where basically there's some kind of rhetorical persuasion and, you know, going on where we're using, you know, basically, you know, there are think tanks that have gone to school and gotten PhDs in rhetoric, and they're basically trying to frame these kinds of conversations with certain types of narrative where, you know, the example that I have is not Mark Johnson, it's Johnson, oh, George Lakoff.
Mhm.
George Lakoff retired from Berkeley and basically said he didn't have time to talk to people because he was really focused on the 2016 and eventually the 2020 elections to make sure that the Democrats won, to try and figure out the cognitive, cognitive metaphor kind of reasons for political differences.
May I?
Oh, please, you were doing the waffle weave there.
Yeah.
Intensely. Please jump in.
I kind of see the distinction you're establishing. And you said sometimes you want to see what's the bigger narrative when there's conflicting narratives. For me, they are the same. It's for me, those two types of narratives are exactly the same. It's really this somebody has an explanation and they're trying to get people to think in terms of that explanation, or they got to think in terms of that explanation, and now it's become part of their mental apparatus. The whole maybe I'm focusing too much on the example rather than the principle, but when you say the wine is the blood, it's you've accepted this causal explanation that the wine is not just standing for, but it acts as the blood and has the same functions as. So for me, that's still a causal mechanism. And you're saying, you have internalized this and it's now part of your mental apparatus. And that means you may transmit that story to eventual children or friends or whoever, right? Because you're trying to make them see this as a valid causal mechanism. And when you're writing a novel, you're also telling a story about, well, people sometimes do act that way, or this is an actual social mechanism in the case of more sociological than psychological stories. I just was exposed to Zeynep Tufekci's beautiful takedown of Game of Thrones season 8. I don't know if you saw that, where she says the failure of season 8 is that they were using psychological storytelling mechanism, whereas until then it had been sociological storytelling mechanism. I will get that URL back. Anyway, I've got a whole other kind of thing I want to talk about, and how it's coming to the hour, but I'll let you go while I'm looking for the.
The real reason fans hate the last season of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, you got it. Good.
I will post it in the Zoom. Julian, go ahead.
So Mark C., I'm not real familiar with I'm not at all familiar with Catholic practices. So in terms of perceiving a story differently, I would like to know how this drinking the blood and eating the bodies differs from cannibalism.
It doesn't.
Well, that was a quick and simple answer.
So you're okay with the fundamental hypocrisy there then? Right.
So it's similar. It's similar to a tribal warrior tearing the heart out of somebody he just killed and eating the heart to get some of the courage of his antagonist. Pardon?
But that is an act of transmutation or whatever versus tribes or people who hunted other people for food. One is,
well, that wasn't for food, that was for courage. I don't think the warrior eats the heart for food.
No, but the idea of cannibalism is about food, not about the trans, the I'm going to absorb your power in the most fundamental way.
Two kinds, yes. People eat people for food, and people eat people for ritual.
The Catholic practice is about transmutating the power of Christ into the power of that person, or?
As a basis for communion. It's not for power, it's for communion. Well, it's for creating unity because we share that blood and flesh.
Yeah, participating in the divine. I mean, it's complicated, and there were 100-year wars because of just that difference between the Eucharist for Catholics and the Eucharist for Protestants.
Which just points out to me that this was a religion that doesn't function so well if there could have been so many wars over time over stupid ass things like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, goes back to the Shia and Sunni, like every major Abrahamic religion has these schisms that are like, seriously, are the fundamental roots of this religion simply not functional at all, that they would kill off their brethren?
The problem is that inherent in monotheism is the notion that there's a single truth,
Right.
and that, you know, you're either right or wrong about
It's
something.
monotruthism.
And what?
It's
Yeah,
monotruthism.
monotruth. I remember we were speaking one of these conflicts with my wife, who's Indian and of Hindu background, and she wanted to say, you know, something's wrong with these monotheistic religions, and instead she said, "What's wrong with those monolithic religions?"
That's good.
Now we were speaking about Islam, so the monolith was especially appropriate, but I think it's the same idea, right? It's the monolith, it's one truth. The tables of law are also a monolith. Thank you very much. It's the one stone on which the one truth is inscribed. Yes, everyone must get stoned in both senses of the word, actually.
Don't forget the stone imparts wisdom and turns you from apes into humans. So.
Yeah. It's still the monolith, absolutely. And again, there's a single truth. And what a ridiculous perspective. And that's why I'm so invested in multiple truths, multiple point of view, multiple choral explanations, choral, you know, it's yeah, the postmodernism has been terrible on the one hand. I've been much more, because it's enabled a kind of cynicism, truth anomie, and anti-expertise. And now I think it's important to say, no, there is such a thing as truth. There is such a thing as falsehood. But on the other hand, the one truth has been a terrible way of exclusion. So there's this kind of weird balance between reclaiming truth and reclaiming. Okay, we'll have to leave. We're closing. I just want to put totally unrelated conversation. This is the latest Mike Caulfield article. If you haven't read it, please read it. Ooh. He's making a big plea about, you know, maybe getting everybody to act as experts and investigate every question as an expert is not the best way to help people interact with truth and false information. Absolutely fascinating topic that I'd like us to take on next time.
Wow, that sounds great. I like that. Small thing before we fold. We didn't do a call on Thanksgiving morning, and I'm pondering whether to hold a call on this week on Thursday or not. Probably, I'm leaning toward not. Any thoughts?
I'm usually not doing the Thursdays.
Although wait, Thursday is Christmas. Thursday is not Christmas Eve. Friday is Christmas Eve, so it's actually not bad. So I think I will hold Thursday's call after all. So I just answered my own question. I had the dates mixed up.
But what about the 30th? Again, it's not New Year's Eve.
Yeah, exactly. The 30th is no problem. And also the celebrations. So Christmas Eve morning would be bad time to sort of, you know, that's sketchy because you know, that's already the beginning of celebrated Christmas, where New Year's Eve is like at midnight and we don't hold our call at midnight. So I'm good there. So my sport is Aikido, and this year, again, only for the second time, we're going to do a ceremony, not at midnight on New Year's Eve, but at 6 p.m., where you do a bunch of throws, you do some meditation, and then you pour cold water over yourself in a Japanese purification ritual. It's kind of a Shinto ritual. It's kind of cool. It's freezing, so you bring a change of clothes. You do this, you step outside, and like, it's the ice bucket challenge, only actually legit Shinto ritual. So that should be fun. Anyway, Lauren, you asked a question early in this conversation that took us down this path. It was a beautiful path. I think it like a really important topic. I learned a whole lot from all of you. I am grateful and happy, and my brain is like had a very nice meal right now. Part of which I've expressed in my little curated view. I was looking for the phrase we started with. Julian, you may have the last word here.
It's actually unrelated to the entire last hour, but I heard a really good observation yesterday, which is that say what you will about Tucker Carlson, but he's killed more Nazis than anybody in the last 70 years.
Ooh, I like that. Oh, that's really good. If dark. Laura Ann, do you want to have the last word?
No, mine was a simple, practical query, and that is, based on what you know of what is out there, what do you think are the most user-friendly and robust enough shareable mind mapping tools? No, dynamic, not I can email it to you or expose it to you, but that different people in different parts of the world can work on it.
You're sort of pointing to the existence question for Free Jerry's Brain and Open Global Mind, which is, I don't know of one. I happen to really like the brain for a few really narrow reasons that we've talked about early in the series. And so I would love to have something that preserves those couple features into a medium that is happily multi-user and allows us to storytell with it, which I can't do easily with the brain, and a bunch of other things like that. And then most of the other tools I find are limited in one way or another because they're only query tools and don't allow for personal expression or whatever, right? This curated view thing is like very important in the medium. So this is probably a conversation we should have in more depth as well. I mean, your question is central to OGM.
Yeah, I need to, on a very basic way, create a team model, dynamic model around an ecosystem of our agenda, and to be able to turn on and turn off the clutter of the editorial.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes I just want to look at the ecosystem and see fresh patterns, move stuff around, and sometimes I want to click in and see, but I need it to be, it does not need to be Jerry's Brain. It doesn't have to have, it has a certain, it's much smaller, but.
Well, there's two tools out there that are trying to be purpose for this, but they both require extremely skilled information architects to be part of the crowd. One is, Mark just wrote Miro in the chat, and the other one is
Miro doesn't turn on and off. Miro
and the other one's Notion. The other one is Notion.
Notion.
Well, turn on and off is relative because you could draw everybody's attention over here to the place where it's well curated. You could declare a frame, which is like the center of the world for this project. And that's the space where you meet when everything gets too confusing, and that's where you get rid of all the personal opinions. You can't turn off layers easily. Like, it's messy. And I've seen Miro and Notion spaces really rapidly degenerate into like a whole bunch of garbage because nobody was paying attention to the curation.
Yeah, well, Miro is great, but it's a series of whiteboards within a big whiteboard, and it's not easy to move things over and to have the views that I want unless I spend all day designing whiteboards for a meeting. And that's valid, but that's not what I'm after. Something more like old Mind Mapper, right? Like, but I need it to
do look at Debate Graph, which I put in the chat.
Yeah. Okay.
It doesn't. I don't know if it will have the turn on and off, but it is a well-designed graph mapping tool. There's others.
You played with Lucid Chart or with Canva's mind mapping or any of those? I'm looking for something really user-friendly for a remote team.
I'm not sure when Pete Kaminsky's back, but he demoed a charting of a Thursday call that he was able to, hide and show and, integrate the map with an outline and, wiki view. And he has gotten fairly quickly adept at presenting using the Obsidian graph.
Right. So you were talking about the plugins for Obsidian. So there's a graph view plugin. There's a couple other. There's a backlinks plugin. There's a few things that add features to Obsidian.
Wouldn't call that user friendly yet, though.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't want to hijack your morning, but
no. Yours is a great question.
There's great collections of such tools. There's one I'm trying to remember the name of, but anyway,
If you only had a brain, Mark.
Didn't OGM do a cook-off of tools?
We had a hoedown, but it wasn't the big roundup. It was just a couple different tools. Like Robert Best was using Mind Manager. I was in the brain. Somebody was in Kumu. Somebody else was using Miro. So we had a few tools up, like 6 to 8.
By the way, I know I spoke about it many times, but Mark, you're aware of the Tools for Thoughts rocks, the fission. Yeah, but that's they have their own curated collection. We have a collection in CDL, and I should maybe look at
That sounds like a great thing. Lauren, I'm going to put the video for the hoedown in the chat so that you can see what that was all about.
Cool.
And then here it is in my brain. Actually, here's the brain link for the same call, the hoedown. And the brain link includes links up to all the tools
So this
that we're
is
using and that we mentioned.
Mind call, separate from our usual.
There we go. So you'll see what we were playing with. And my brain link will show you, lead you back to all the tools that we mentioned or used.
Got it.
And I just put a Perl tree into the chat where somebody was
Sweet.
doing a collection of mind mapping tools.
Haven't seen a Perl tree in a long time since they lobotomized that tool.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. This has been brilliant.
It has been. And thank you for the article, Marc-Antoine. I look forward to diving into that.
Same here. Same here. Thanks, everybody.
Bye,
Have
guys.
fun.
See you on the internet.
See you all.